carbon will just stay in the soil. If there aren't worms and other decomposers that can do the job of converting that carbon back into food for trees and plants. So who's going to do this job? Worms, right? It's not me and you. We don't eat our own waste. We just leave it. And so thank God worms come and eat all of this leftover stuff. Because if it wasn't for them doing the job of turning that carbon into available nutrients for the rootstock, it would just sit there. So what's the difference between soil and dirt? Does anybody know?
Soil has nutrients in it, like
Soil's
good
alive,
stuff.
right? Soil's alive.
Alive.
It has nutrients, it has organisms, it isn't just dust and sand. You can see I took a soil sample here, this 20 minutes ago, this morning, and shook it up. And the soil and the rock and the clay are going to separate into what's heaviest and what's lightest. All the lightest stuff, this dust, this clay, silt, it's all going to blow away. So that's the dirt. It doesn't really have the ability to retain moisture. Moisture and carbon are very closely related. When moisture leaves the soil, so does carbon at an enormous rate. Much, much faster than covered soil. That's why cover crops are so important. But cover crops can't survive if you don't have worms. And worms can't survive without the cover crop. So those things are two very, very interrelated concepts. Carbon and water need to both be trapped in the soil for us to have effective soil. You can see all the light stuff goes to the top. That means when it rains, it all gets washed away. This is really, really bad in farming. Did you know that the Dust Bowl, raise your hand if you have heard of the Dust Bowl. Some folks are kind of young here. Did you know that the Dust Bowl is a man-made disaster from us just over-tilling the soil? We know that tilling destroys more microbes, and we know that this erodes the soil in a way that makes it impossible for us to grow. So if we don't take care of the soil, if we don't take care of our worms, if we don't take care of the microbes that live there, we have literally about 60 harvests left. The world's desertification is a big problem. I don't know what the word is. The world is desertifying. So it's becoming harder and harder to grow all over the world. We need to put more inputs into the soil to get food out. So adding all of that nitrogen into the system is very, very, very hard on the soil. That's how we end up with dust, dirt, and not actual soil. Yeah, so thank you for coming to my TED Talk, my spiel about how incredibly important soil is. And we know that if we want to have healthy gardens and healthy soil, we have to be able to support the life that lives there. So we're going to make some worm habitats. And worms aren't the only things that live in soil, right? What else lives underground that helps do that decomposing work? Does anybody know?
I know that moles live under the
Absolutely! Thank God for moles, right? Every gardener loves a good mole. JK. Yeah. Yes, it is super important that we take care of all of those guys that live in the soil. I lost my train of thought because I was so amused at the idea of moles and worms living together. Okay, so the other thing that does a really good job of decomposing is soldier flies. Soldier flies are bigger than regular flies, and they actually help scare away house flies and fruit flies because they're the dominant species of fly. They eat your compost a lot faster than worms. So they're actually really great. You see soldier flies usually in your compost as they look like caterpillars, and they prefer green matter. So when you're making your compost bin, you want to have some browns and some greens. You can mix them half and half, and you can use that as sort of a rule of thumb. Don't put more than half greens in there, but you should kind of be 70% browns. So browns are like paper, cardboard. You can use mail. I use my mail a lot. I feel like some people are really picky about that. They're like, if there's ink on it or if it's laminated, guess what? Worms eat poop. So I feel like they're okay with a little bit of the ink that's on my mail. It does get into your food. So you have to like reason with that and reckon with that. Every single thing that's in our soil is going to be transferred to our food. So it depends how picky you are about your compost. You want it to be a pretty good mix of browns and greens. If you want to have a lot of soldier flies, you put your greens on the top because that's where they'll land and they'll eat the stuff that's decomposing.
Are those soldier flies? Are they maggots? Little white? You said they look like caterpillars?
You would see them as maggots before they go through metamorphosis. So when you find them in your compost, when they're in that larva stage, they're eating about as much as 10 worms every day. They're eating much more than their body weight, which a worm can eat about half its body weight. I mean, worms are little, but that's a lot if you think about how many pounds of food you would have to eat your own body weight. And they prefer what's on the top. So if you have a stinky compost, and also manure, soldier flies love manure, they don't care at all. So if you have a stinky compost pile, you're gonna have a lot of soldier flies. The good news is they eat a lot really fast, and they leave almost nothing behind. So they'll take a compost piece this tall and make it to the ground. Great if you're trying to get rid of your compost, but if you want to harvest your compost and keep your compost, you want a kind of healthy mix of both. If you want more earthworms, you bury the green stuff down and then put brown on top. So it would be like food scraps and then leaf litter on top. That would encourage the earthworms because the heat is going to be trapped inside the pile at the bottom, and that's where they're going to naturally migrate, is down towards the food layer. So I will let you guys look at Kathy's worm bin when we break, and it has some really good examples. On the top, you'll see food that's mostly food. And in the middle layer, the worms are living mostly in that layer. And the middle layer, that is where you'll see some decomposition, and you'll also see some whole food. And the worms love it here because it's got a mix of everything that they need, the right 50-50 maybe of greens to brown. On the bottom, you'll see it's all finished compost. And they rarely go down there because there's really no more food in that layer. So a few things about worms: they don't drown. A lot of people think that because you see them on the sidewalk maybe after it rains. And they will get forced up out of their holes. This is what happens. The ground becomes saturated, and because they're buoyant, they just lift up to the top. They're not drowning, and they can't drown. They don't have lungs, so they don't drown like a human being would drown. They have 5 hearts, so do not cut them in half. This is like a common thing that we were told as a kid: if you cut a worm in half, that you'll have 2 worms. Only 1/2 of the worm survives. A lot of my students on worm day would tell me that one. And that daddy longlegs are the most poisonous spider in the world. They just can't bite because they don't have fangs. So that's another one that I like to myth bust for kids. They're certainly not poisonous, and no, they can have bite. So worms do not regenerate their whole body on both sides. They just regenerate the half that's cut off. It's really intense for the worm to have to regenerate half of its body, so it's not going to be doing a lot of productivity in that period. Don't cut worms in half. It doesn't really make 2 worms. They don't have eyes, but they can see. And it's a kind of sense where they can tell if it's sunny or dark. And before we were the organisms that we were, we had a similar photosense, where we could just tell as organisms if it was light or dark. So when it is cloudy, they don't necessarily know that they're at the surface if it is cool, and they can become paralyzed. That's why you sometimes see them after the rain. Sun will paralyze them after about an hour, and they, so if you see them and they're on the sidewalk, toss them back. They'll probably get eaten by a bird in the meantime, but that's the cycle of nature too. Worms are food. Worms do not like meat scraps. They don't typically like anything that isn't grown from the earth. So even though cows come from the earth, it isn't, bones are really hard for them. They have mouths but not teeth, so don't put any bone scraps in your compost bin if you want worms to eat it. And they don't particularly like cheese either. Things that are really oily and really high fats tend to sour. Animal fats spoil while vegetable fats decompose. So you'll see that if you put like gristle from a steak in there, it will change the microbiology. Basically, there are certain microbes that eat meat and certain microbes that eat vegetables. So if you want your compost to be really healthy, I would avoid putting meat in it in general. Are there any questions about compost, worms? I feel like I've said a lot.
Where do you put your meat stuff and bones? Do you bury it or
I put it in the trash, and also at my house we don't eat a lot of meat. Does anybody else have a strategy when you separate meat? Kathy, you have an answer for that?
Well, I do know that you can compost meat. It's like you said, it's probably not the worms that are going to break it down in the compost. You need like a high heat environment. So I have compost now, and they have like this like oxygen thing where they like, or their composting system, they like blow oxygen into the compost as it's being made, and they're like constantly turning it, and that heats up the compost to like 170 degrees or something like that.
Okay.
And then all of that like breaks down and actually neutralizes harmful bacteria and stuff like that. So it is possible to compost meat scraps and bones and things like that, but it's probably not a good idea to put it in your worm bin to compost it. So yeah,
That's a nice plug for compost now. They'll take your meat scraps.
they'll take your meat scraps.
Yeah, and I know other folks who live like in cities or apartment buildings where it's a little harder to compost. I've heard of freezing your compost, and you could still add it to your worm bin after it's frozen. Any other questions?
What about like cooked vegetable? Like if you took your scraps and made a stock with it, can you throw that in the compost afterwards?
Yep. Yeah, salt is generally not great for your system, and I've never had a problem throwing it in there. Salt is like part of the breaking down process, so I'm guessing that it's a minimal effect that it would have on the overall system.
Pros and cons of having more of the flies versus more worms.
Great question. Worms leave more dirt and soil in their wake, and soldier flies just go to work a lot faster. They consume more and they leave less behind. So ideally you'd really have a mix of both. And in a healthy system where you're turning your compost outdoors, you would get that green matter that maybe is stuck at the bottom, flip to the top, and then just attract flies to it. Yes.
Bread. We do bread
Yeah.
and supplement everything.
Yep. And if you have kombucha at home, you can throw your SCOBY in there. And your SCOBY is a great way to keep the beneficial bacteria going so that your compost doesn't turn really stinky. It's using that fermentation process to just create the most out of a small space. I assume if you're composting in your backyard, unless you have acres and acres, you're really trying to keep this contained, right? If you're like me. So a SCOBY or anything that's fermented is a really good way to try to keep that system alive. Bread, absolutely. Even just bread dough.
Crust.
Oh, yep.
Lots of
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay,
No.
human manure and animal poop. Do worms like that, or is that kind of meat category?
So this is really interesting because in developing countries like Haiti, where there's a lack of sanitation, the big push to do composting toilets right now. It cleans the water system. It keeps the water a lot cleaner when you compost into a bucket and then filter that through your compost. So right now you're not allowed to do it in America, and you're not, and like in order to put compost, even like horse or cow compost onto a field, it has to be aged over the winter time so that it has that really deep freeze. Is your question, could you put human manure
What about
in
worms and poop?
in your
Animal
good question.
poop? Not sure.
I'm not sure if worms can do that work. There is a microbe that's doing that work, and in order to be able to use it in your food system,
Hard to say.
I don't want to give you bad advice.
Okay, cool.
I know that it's possible because it's done in other parts
Oh,
of the world.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, she said she's seen no worm composters.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's probably some balance that needs to be there for sawdust.
Same. I mean, that's human waste is considered green
Yeah.
manure, and so same. You would mix it with about 70, maybe more % browns in order to create like a healthy microbe. And with sawdust, like you're saying, covering it with sawdust keeps that in balance so that it's heating up, but also
Yeah,
breaking
the
down.
heat's important, kills pathogens.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'll give you guys a few minutes to take a peek through Kathy's bin that has lots of different stages of composting.
Yeah, I was just reading recently, like, the difference between earthworms and red worms, like the wiggly ones, you know? They don't survive over the winter. Do you recommend one or the other? I mean, like,
So what happens over the winter is that worms do freeze, and they can't dig down deep enough to get through the frost layer sometimes, but their egg sacs do. So if you have ever seen, like, it looks like a little BB, like a little those little silica beads almost that come in shoes and stuff in your compost, those are egg sacs. And so worms are both male and female, and they sort of just touch, and they then have everything they need to create an egg sac. And so they just slip the egg sac off, and that's what will actually survive the winter rather than the worm itself. And in each of those egg sacs, there's hundreds of worms. So if you find one in your compost, you're lucky. Actually, 6 worms will make about 1,500 in 6 months. So it doesn't take long to have a really, really healthy, established worm bin.
So I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Is it harmful to stir your compost if you're doing worm composting, because you could destroy worm egg sacs, or because I often will stir my, because outdoor compost I stir it to increase the level of oxygen, and so I usually stir my worm compost as well.
Well, worms do need oxygen. Even though they don't have lungs, they breathe through their skin, and they do need oxygen. So I'm guessing that just like your compost wants oxygen, they would like a little breath of fresh air. But those eggs are like this big. And also, they're tough. They are supposed to make it through the whole winter. So I feel like it's okay. It's like, if you stir your worm bin, I don't think you're like wiping out the whole population. Yeah. Yes?
So if the worms freeze in the winter, can you still do winter composting?
Yeah, the decomposing matter in your bin is going to generate some heat. And as long as it's, above freezing, they're going to be okay. They may be slow, but they're going to be okay. And that's really the danger of like having a big worm bucket that you keep outside, is that it can sometimes freeze if it's like down to 0. How many days do we get that are so cold?
I don't know, but I keep mine inside.
Yeah.
I keep mine in the basement.
Or if you have a mud room, or even if it's close enough to the house that it's touching, there's some radiant heat that it'll pull that I would think it would not freeze. But yeah, you don't want it to freeze solid.
Right.
That would be a bad sitch. And you want it to stay a little moist, because like we said, they do need, they breathe through their skin. They have that slime layer, and that slime layer is really important too. It actually like serves to coagulate in the soil and helps like that problem of the soil just breaking up and either washing away or blowing away. So yeah, you want to keep it a little bit wet. If you notice it's getting dry, give it a spray.
I'm a little concerned because I have a pretty sizable garden, and I dig out there, and I don't see as many worms as I'd like to see. So just having, and I do compost, and I transfer compost. Like, what's the relationship between, having an active, vermiculture setup, and, hopefully it translates into the soil of my garden. I mean,
Yeah. Do you do a cover crop?
Well, I've thought about it.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing is in the wintertime when you never want to have bare soil for your worms.
Right.
In the wintertime when nothing's growing, even then you want to put a cover crop or a layer of mulch or something over
Mulch.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. We had a bed at Composture like that where we just would dump a whole worm bin every season in it, and still I go back and there's no worms.
No worries. Yeah.
So maybe the soil in that particular area is not well suited for worms and they're migrating somewhere else. Have you done a soil test?
Yeah, I do it okay.
Yeah.
I'm kind of okay.
Well, that's what Kathy told me. The healthier the soil is, the more things will want to live there in balance, right?
Yeah, and if there's nothing for the worms to eat, then they will go somewhere else.
They'll move on.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
What kind of composting situation are you recommending for the best worm production? The open ones with the wire, the plastic on the ground, the rotating ones above ground? Is there anything that is...
The rotating ones I find are really bad for worms and for microbes and things in general. They keep everything up off and they get really hot. So maybe if you're doing more like meat scraps, that is beneficial. Worms love layers. So they love it to be like the densest layer at the bottom where all the finished compost is. That's where they're going to push everything. And then one of these bins is really great, like a worm composting bin. But if you wanted to scale it up, like metal screens are the way that you sort of divide layers. So you could put a lot of food, put one of these metal screens layer there, and then a lot of like brown on top. And they'll migrate in and out through the mesh to find, oh, I need more leaves, or okay, it's getting, and so at the end it'll all be finished compost. That would be my advice, is those layers are really beneficial for them. And you'll see when you come see this one, the bottom layer is pretty much done.
I have a question about bears and compost. I live in a community and we really have never had a problem with, although we have bears coming around. But I've been curious as to why the bears are not interested in the compost.
Oh, you're lucky.
Oh, okay. I just.
That's good news. They must be finding something better to eat somewhere than compost.
Okay. I'm just curious, but it is a problem for some
Well,
people.
my compost never gets full because the bears come and eat it before it ever gets to the top. And possums and different things, but I have an outdoor one.
Well, that's what we have.
But yeah, I think bears love compost. And I would love to hear strategies about keeping bears out of compost. Because sometimes
Urine.
you build a really
Human
nice
urine.
Okay, yeah. And I've heard that for other predators, that if you use wolf urine,
Oh yeah.
but yeah.
I suppose the pine sol is that if you pine sol on like a candle with some kind of outdoor teak board or something like that.
Oh, cool.
It's supposedly it's really strong.
Are you saying pine
No, not
salt's
burning
good?
and stuff, but yeah.
Okay.
The smell.
Scent is very powerful.
Scent, yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
I've also heard that they really like kind of like long tube things like stems and stuff. Is that kind of stems?
That's a cool fun fact. I don't know.
Okay, not sure.
What was your question? I couldn't hear it.
That they like stems? That worms like long tubular things, like a stem of a flower or something. They went like that. I know that one thing I've heard is like leave stems in the garden because of praying mantises and things like.
Oh yeah, they live in there over winter.
Okay, so I think I'll give you guys a minute to look. There are some containers if you want to make a worm bin. Then we'll probably put into groups of 3 or 4 or so if you want to make one. There are containers back there next to the sink. And then I guess we'll meet back here in maybe 10. And I'll give you all the lowdown on how to make it.